Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to finish our coverage now of the Knight BD7 Classical King's Indian and look at the ways that White can try and exploit our move order, starting with Knight BD7 before E5. I should point out now that if you're worried about anything in this video, then you can start with E5 and then play Knight BD7 the next move. I tend to play about half and half just to keep my opponents guessing. Playing E5 immediately, of course, has downside of allowing the exchange variation, but it's not the end of the world. And it's useful to keep your opponent guessing as much as possible. So we get to the position here and Knight B7. I just emphasize, start with E5, castle, and then Knight B7 is also perfectly fine. In the vast majority of cases, my opponents have castled here, and E5 is transposed back. But we should have a look at and see what other options White has available. There are quite a few of them, but most are not challenging. Once again, White could try putting the bishop out to G5 in one go. We'll kick it back. Now going back to E3, then we'll just play E5 and Queen E7. The usual stuff. We've got a lot of familiarity with this position by now. So the bishop could go back to G5, back to H4 from G5. We'll play E5. Now, castle was already covered via the starting with castle and then playing bishop G5. White could try Queen C2 as well, but after C6 and Queen E7, White's not going to be able to make do without castling kingside when we're going to transpose back into the main lines again. And so D5 here, G5. So here we've actually transposed to a more theoretical position, including one game between Kramnik and Kasparov. White's trying to stay flexible with his king for now. If he castles, then we're going to drop this knight into F4. In general, the plan is to put the knight in F4. As usual, we just need to be careful once we played H6 and G5 that White won't be able to control the F5 square. This is a strategic risk. So we want to be able to play F5 before White has had time to go Knight D2 to F1 to E3 when we might be under an unpleasant bind. Generally, the plan is to put the knight in F4, but if White exploits the fact he's not castled yet and goes H4, then we'll be obliged to take on G3, but at least F takes will be forced, wrecking White's structure in the process. There's a few moves. White could try Knight D2, but we'll jump in. Now we're attacking the pawn on G2. Castle is a sensible way to do it. Bishop F1 was tried by Dmitry Andreikin, very strong Russian grandmaster. It's a rather sad move to play, retreating that bishop. We hop in, we're threatening to land on D3, so I need to do something with that. At B3 and B6. We always want to be able to recapture towards the center if we can, maintain our solid bind with this pawn on D6, and we're ready to play F5 next. And our attack is already alive and kicking. So castle is more sensible. We develop our knight. Now, White can't kick our knight away with B4 because we'll just continue forward, attacking the one on B4, and our knights are very powerful. We'll be able to exchange on E2 and put the other knight on F4 with a very nice position. F5 is still coming. So White could play bishop G4. Now this, in general, is something White wants to achieve, the exchange of the light square bishops, and he's increasing his control over the F5 square. But unfortunately for him, we're fast enough with the exchange in H5, an important concept when there's bishop on G3 and H4, forcing the capture when we can recapture with the E-pawn, and our bishop on G7 suddenly comes to light. Strategically, we're doing fantastically here with this very strong dark square bishop. But we need to watch out because of knight F3, when knight takes G5 looks like a huge threat with Queen H7 mate. But we don't need to panic. Queen F6 to force the queens off the board. White can temporarily win a pawn, but here we've got too much pressure on White's position. We're going to at least win back this pawn on E4 with bishop takes C3, knight takes E4, and rook E5 to force the knight back. And we also have ideas of knight D3, targeting the pawn on B2. And so we're doing completely fine here. White could also try castle, kind of a normal move, but doesn't really put any pressure on us. We jump in again. Now putting the knight on D2 would be sensible, but that will just come back to what we just looked at. Instead, E1 has been played, but it's a less logical square. because it's a long way from the f5 square. He's trying to go via c2 to e3, but he's just not really in time. The control of the e4 square is also important, and the knight is not doing anything on e1. So we play f5. He has to take. We can grab that bishop and move the knight out of the way so that we can recapture the f5 pawn with our bishop. We developed our pieces. The knight on e1 is not controlling the e4 square in the slightest, and so we're already better. White's not going to set up a bind on e4 here. So h4 is probably critical. White's trying to open the h file and exploit the fact he's not castled yet, but it comes at a cost. First we push the knight back, and then we can capture on g3, wrecking White's structure. We've got quite an odd position here. The pawns on g3 makes a very odd impression. White's hope is that he'll have time to control the f5 square with knight f1 to e3 and put something on f5. And this is what we just need to make sure that shouldn't happen, that we'll be able to break with f5 before White gets any kind of bind on the position. So White castles, putting a bit more control on f5, move our knight out of the way, so ready to play f5. By the way, up to here was following Kramnik-Kasparov from the Narrows 94, so a very high quality game. But I quite like knight c5. Going ready for f5, we're provoking b4, hitting our knight, but we can happily drop back. Now we're ready to play a5, undermining White's control of the c5 square. We've seen already quite a few times where we're not very worried by b4 once the dark square bishop has been exchanged, because if White is missing this bishop on e3, then it's very difficult to get in c4, c5 and actually keep control of the c5 square long term. Once a5 happens, White will want to play a3, or else he'll lose control of the c5 square. But when we have the option of exchanging rooks on a1, it's going to be very difficult for White to take any control of the f5 and e4 key squares in the center. And so we're going to have time to play f5 ourselves, and we've got no problems. So that is bishop g5. h3 is tried here as well. e5. This would be a bit more common for White to play with the bishop back on f1. It's a bit of an unusual hybrid, playing bishop e2 first and then h3. And we go after this pawn on e4, queen c2. Now, if we played the natural move, a5 here, to keep the knight on c5, we'd actually transpose out of our repertoire into a different line of the h3 King's Indian, Makhganogov systems. It's perfectly playable, but I would prefer to avoid it. And so let's keep things independent with knight h5. Now, of course, we're provoking b4, but we're going to get good and quick counterplay here. White's not quite in time to break with c5 himself. Remember, this concept of knight h5 is useful when the pawn is already on h3, because g3 is a bit more, a bit looser than it would be with the pawn back on h2. White's tried kicking the queen, but here f6. Remember the rule of thumb, we're not worried to play f6 when the centre's already closed, because f5 is our plan anyway. And so it's not created any problems for us at all. Here we're very quick in the center. So b4 must be critical, hitting our knight back. Now, I don't want to go to a6. It looks like a6 gains a tempo, attacking the pawn on b4, but the problem is the knight gets in the way on a6. And makes it very it's out of play by itself. It doesn't do anything other than attacking the pawn, say rook b1 or a3 to defend it. And also means that it's very difficult to actually generate any counterplay over on the queen side. I want to be able to play a5. a5 is already a big threat here, because White can't react with a3 because the rook is undefended on a1. If White has to take or play b5, we can be really happy because we'll have the c5 square for life. So rook b1 would be sensible. We'll play a5 anyway, and a3. White wants to cement the c, or at least fight for the c5 square, not just give it to us. But we can jump on the other side with knight f4. This was a point of knight h5, that we have double threats, a5 on one side of the board and knight f4 on the other. Now White needed to defend the g-pawn, so say castle. But here, h6 is a nice move. We're getting ready to play f5, and it's difficult for white to improve. h6 is very subtle, but the thing is, if we start with f5, white can take on f4. Here, take on e4 would allow bishop g5, hence why we want to play h6 first to control that square. And ef4, ef, and our initiative has been diffused somewhat here. White can hope for something with his control of the e4 square, and we're not getting a kingside attack here. So let's be patient. f5 is coming, but we're going to first control the g5 square. Now if white simply develops, we can exchange, play b6 to slow up c5, and f5 is our next move, with the customary kingside attack. I could try and keep the bishop, but now we've got an interesting plan of exchanging knight f6. The plan is either to go to h5 to support this knight on f4, or to drop back to h7 and jump into g5 to open up lines for our queen to join the attack. When the knight moves from f6, we're also ready to play our f5 break. And here we come. White's pieces are very passive, and his counterplay is just too slow. Knight h2 is kind of thematic way of trying to reroute these pieces a bit, but now we can play f5 with the knight misplaced on h2. Exchange. And here the difference. We don't need to simply recapture on f5, but we can exploit the knight being back on h2 with knight e5. A very nice move. The knight is very strong. We activate our bishop, ready to recapture on f5. And we also have ideas of like f3, opening up white's king. For example, take on g6 and f3, bang, we can do it immediately. Sacrifice everything. Queen g5. White can't go to h2 because of bishop e5 check, and we're going to take on h3 with the bishop, or play queen h5 and take on h3 with our queen after king h1. It's just simply mate here in a variety of ways. So g3 would stop knight f4, but that doesn't deal with the threat over on the queen side, so we can play a5. Now a3 is impossible because we just take on b4, the rook isn't defended. After b5, we now have the c5 square. Not only do we have a very pretty outpost on c5, but also white's attack on the queen side grinds to a halt. Go back to f5, and again we can exploit some tricks with knight c5 here. Even stronger than recapturing immediately. We're ready to take with the bishop, and we also have some ideas of e4 with opening the long diagonal. Suddenly the rook on a1 is very vulnerable. Take on g6, bishop f5 anyway. We're happy to sacrifice a couple of pawns for a mammoth initiative here. Queen moves, and queen f6, threatening e4, both attacking the knight on c3, diagonal on f3, and with some huge threats along the f file to that f2 pawn, and by extension white's king. Knight h4 is the only try. Bishop b2 here would lose to the pretty bishop d3. If the bishop is taken, we'll take on f3, attacking both the rook on h1 and the bishop on d3, and otherwise e4 is coming. So knight h4 needs to be tried, but now we can plow on with the e4. The knight's attacked on c3. I can try taking, or recapture. Now f2 is a big threat. Grab another pawn, but we can just ignore it. Put a king in the corner. So white has picked up, is it 3 pawns? That e pawn has been very hungry, very greedy. But now white's king is in a lot of trouble. Bishop g4 would lose in that d3 check. Queen takes f2 is coming next move. Even if queen takes d3, queen takes f2 is check. So there's no time to exchange queens. So castle is the sensible way to defend the pawn on f2. But now we regain 1 pawn, but more importantly, we're ready to crash through with knight takes g3. For example, queen e3, supporting it for a move. We increase the pressure. And if white grabs another pawn, we're ready with knight takes g3. And we crash through. The knight needs taking, but then take on g3. If the king goes in the corner, queen h2 is mate, so the queen has to come back. We can exchange. And queen h4 is nice. Just getting out of the queen exchange. We're now threatening bishop d4, mating. Remember, this rook is also hanging on a1. It's a key point. So bishop b2, and the way to stop bishop d4 and taking the rook. But we play it anyway. After the bishop exchange, we're finally ready to take the rook. Next move, we'll have a solid extra exchange. See how fantastic a job the pawn on h7 is doing of hiding our king. With no pieces attacking on the dark squares, our king is perfectly safe. So that is this knight takes g3, pretty move. Now we return to the options for white. Jens Christiansen, a Danish grandmaster, tried e5 against me once, which definitely is checking, because if it's a good move, it refutes our whole concept. But luckily, we're happy to take and go knight g4. Now the pawn is lost on e5. We're attacking it 3 times. It's only defended once. So white's idea is to play e6, giving up the pawn to damage our structure. But here we're going to be fast enough to develop our pieces. We'll give back the extra pawn if necessary, but we'll have some open lines for our pieces. For example, bishop g5. We'll still play knight d5. You can take the pawn on e7 if you want, but our pieces are very active. For example, the queen's exchanged. Kick that bishop back, and b6. With our bishops both on the open long diagonals, we have good control of the board. Our pawn on e6 is a slight weakness, but the pawn on c4 is also not particularly safe, and our pieces are active enough to compensate. Jans tried castle. Here we can simply exchange knights. And here, during the game, I remember being a bit worried that it'd be difficult to find any kind of activity for our pieces blocked in by our own pawns on, well, by the pawn on e6 in general. But a nice regrouping is knight c6 with the intention of putting the knight on d4. And then pushing this pawn and actually utilizing it, our extra pawn. Play e5, supporting the knight on d4, which is a nice outpost. Then we're ready to develop the bishop from c8. Example c5, knight in. White can try bishop c4, but just get out of the pin. Next we'll play e5, bishop f5, and our pieces develop, and we're a pawn to the good. What else can white try? Queen c2 is interesting, giving the pawn on e4 a bit more support, but it doesn't change our plan. e5. One thing to be aware of here is we should play knight c5. Don't try and play our structure. I know it's a nice structure to play once white's castle kingside, but if white hasn't castle kingside yet, then it's very risky. This is because we're closing the board with c5. The idea is that we're trying to blockade the queen side and to turn everything to a kingside attack. Now that's perfectly fine once white's castle kingside, because it's generally us that's attacking. But if white's king is still in the center, then he can play h3, followed by g4, and our counterplay is extremely limited here. If we can't get in the f5 break, then it's not clear what we are doing. White's king, on the other hand, is likely to go queenside. We can try and get something with a6, b5, but if that's our only lever, the position becomes quite risky. So don't play for the c5 break until white is, or c5 blockade, until white's castle kingside, or else you might get a bit squashed like this. Luckily, we have knight c5, the other plan. Now the position is going to be fairly normal if we play a5. For example, castle a5, I think, is a direct transposition to 8d5. And therefore, b4 is the important move to check. But here we see we can exploit the weak long diagonal. It looks perfectly safe for white for now, with pawns on e5 and e4. But this is a concept we've seen already earlier in the video. We can sacrifice a piece and then f5. Now our plan is simply to play e4 next move, and the rook on a1 and knight on f3 will both be hanging. For example, if queen h4, trying to get some counterplay, e4. Now knight g5 temporarily defends both threats. Don't take the rook yet, because we're getting mated on h7. But h6 stops the mate, and we can take on g5 whenever we want. The knight can't actually go anywhere, so we don't need to rush anything here. Queen b1 is an ugly looking move, but it at least does the job of defending the rook on a1. We continue in the center, and much stronger than taking the rook is playing queen f6. Now we're threatening, instead of just winning the exchange back when white would have 2 pieces, we're threatening to win the rook for free. So it needs to be defended with knight b3. And we continue attacking with f4. We're bringing the bishop on c8 into play, and therefore the rook on a8 is also joining, and white's king is looking rather weak, with the queen on b1 and rook on a1 completely out of the game. Castle would be tempting just to try and get that king to safety, but we simply defend the pawn on e4 with rook e8. We're ready to play bishop f5 and e3 when the queen on b1 is actually extremely short on squares. Also ideas of playing f3, of course, and just mating white are very tempting. Therefore, white should really grab this pawn. But he's spending a lot of time with his queen. We'll attack the queen again. Now he can't grab another pawn. He is a piece and a pawn up here, but it's actually completely lost. We have too much pressure. For example, bishop e3, trying to blockade, runs into queen c3 check, stop the check, sacrifice. Another exchange, but check. Now white's queen is attacked. e1 is the only square where we don't have a check. King d1, that was queen c2 check. So rook e8 check, ignoring the queen, but going for mate. Once king d1, we have queen c2 mate. So queen e3 is necessary. We pick up the queen and we continue attacking. Therefore, you can't grab the pawn f4, so queen f3, but we play the same way with rook a8. Actually, the engine gives lots of options for black here with the 0-0 valuation, but rook a8 seems most sensible to me. Now, I would say that castle is what white would try. Bishop takes f4 is sort of tempting. I can see the thought process. White decides that there's a lot of pressure, so let's just give back a piece to exchange queens. I'll still be a pawn up, and maybe I've got some chances. But actually, white's just completely lost here. The e-file pin is just too annoying. And remember, the rook is still hanging on a1. So white just doesn't have enough time to develop his pieces. With this pin down the e-file, after a queen exchange on f4, and we shift the bishop, well, can take on g2, but the rook then can also take on c4 using the pin. So it's just the whole position is collapsing for white. So castle, and now a nice move, increasing the pressure. h5. Threatening bishop g4, winning the bishop on e2, and then the rook on f1 by extension. So white needs to prevent it somehow. Now most of the ways to prevent it fail. Bishop d3 saves the bishop, but at a rather big cost. Bishop g4, this queen is trapped. Queen takes f4 is the only way to not lose the queen for free. After queen exchange, we can take on a1 before taking back on f4. To queen f4, bishop takes f4, bishop takes a1, and we win a whole rook back, and we're up material. h3 likewise, we can play bishop e4, and the queen is trapped. h3 was the only square for the queen that white has kindly just taken with the pawn. So again, queen takes f4 is possible when we play queen takes f4, bishop takes, and then take the rook in the corner, again with a decisive advantage. And so the only move is to drop the bishop back to d1 to keep h3 and d3 squares available for white's queen. And here, white really should take a draw by putting the queen back on f3. Play for more with g4 is too risky. We'll take, pin. We can now regain the exchange so that normally we're a pawn down. We've got rook against piece, bishop and knight. But our piece is so active, white's king is weak, and the queen is ridiculous on h3. Can't move. Try and get that knight back into the game, but rook f7, and we're threatening to trap the queen with rook h7 with a decisive advantage. White could try bishop f4. I can sort of see why opponents might play this. They think we should have played e5 last move. Instead, we played knight bd7. Therefore, well, I'll stop you playing e5 and exploit it. Now, that works up to a point, but we can play e5 anyway. After the exchange, we have the typical King's Indian counter of knight takes e4, regaining the pawn. Because after knight takes d7, knight takes c3 attacks the queen. So white is forced to recapture. And actually, it's just losing a lot of material there because we can take on c3 again with check before recapturing on d7. The knight needs taking, and then knight takes e5. All white has actually achieved by exchanging e4 for e5 is opening up the long diagonal for our bishop. We're always happy with this exchange. White has to be very careful already, not just be worse. A bizarre looking move is d5. Again, trying to exploit the fact we've not got an e5 yet by clamping down in the center. But it's a bit slow. First of all, we've got a nice square for our knight. We need to defend it. And now we can start opening up the center anyway. With e6. The white's king stuck there. Some bishop e3 will take. Now, e takes, trying for a bit more space would be wrong because we gain more time with bishop f5, followed by sticking a piece in on e4. So white has to recapture cd. And we increase the pressure on pawn e4. Now if white tries to defend it again, or attack it again, and f3, c6, we're breaking this bind that white has attempted in the center with pawn on d5, and after dc, bc, we're very comfortable. We're ready to play d5 ourselves. Critical must be to take on c5. When we have this odd structure, white has the two central pawns, and so from a strategic or structural point of view at least, he should be better. But we can actually undermine it quite quickly, and we've got some open lines for our bishops. Still, it's quite a critical position, so we should pay special attention here. For example, castle kingside. Now I like a6. The point is to play b5 and b4 to kick away this knight from c3, or even b5 and then undermine with c6. White wants to stop us playing b5. But now we'll see that including a4 and a6 helps us when we play c6. Now it's true that we're damaging our structure, but we're getting rid of one of white's key central pawns. And now we're going to get counterplay down the b file with some rook b8 and probably queen b6. And the pawn on b2 is quite weak. If the pawns were back on a2 and a7, white would be able to play b3 and keep everything secure. But now the b pawn is going to always be weak. The one on e4 is also not entirely safe, and our bishops give us good long-term counterplay. What's another option? White could try b4, a weird 4 pawns attack, shifted one square to the right. But this is just too loose. We'll continue as normal, and then we can play a5. And white's got that big problem. He doesn't have time to play a3 again because the rook is hanging. So he has to give us the c5 square, which is always a strategic disaster. And we're very fast. Now we've got ideas of knight f4 as well as f5. We've come far too quickly. That pawn on b5 is just in the way. It'd be far better back on b2, at least giving that rook on a1 a bit more comfort. So as it is, f5, ef, and e4 idea is going to be extremely strong, exploiting the long diagonal weakness. This position's actually been reached 7 times, as far as I could see, with black scoring 7 out of 7. Unsurprisingly, the position is just very bad for white. White can go aggressive with h4. This h4 Harry pawn moving has become more and more topical recently. White trying it everywhere. And here is another reasonable try, but we simply play in the center. We don't need to worry too much. And this position is actually transposed to a position we'll cover via the Petrosian variation with the quick h4. To save you having to find it there, after h5, I want to play h6 to stop that pawn going any further. White can take on g6, but after fg, we have good counterplay along the f file. And we're not actually too worried about even sacrificing the pawn on h6 to exchange dark square bishops, because then we're going to have some good activity ourselves on the dark squares. Our queen will jump into g5, and white's king won't feel completely secure. But check out the Petrosian variation for more information about this position. Finally, in offbeat tries, knight d2 is being played, but we can just play as normal. Now, I guess the point of knight d2 was to overprotect the pawn on e4, so that if knight c5, b4 can be played, pushing our knight back. So we should just switch the moves around and play a5. Next, we're playing knight c5. White can try pushing. But yeah, again, we've transposed to a Petrosian variation sideline. So I refer you to the coverage there. So bishop e3. This is the other main move compared to castle. In fact, in practice, after e5, most of my opponents have castled kingside here anyway, and we're back again in the first couple of chapters. Instead, white could try queen d2, but it's a bit premature committing the queen to d2 so fast. We'll play queen e7, and this pawn on e4 is not very happy. You can go d5. And I guess the idea is quite clever by white, that now if we go c5, hoping simply to transpose, white can consider going h3 and g4 again, because he's not castled kingside yet. But we can exploit the fact that the queen has gone to d2 rather early, play knight c5, where it's not so easy to defend this pawn on e4. White could give up the bishop to stop it, but our knight is very fast coming into d6, so we're happy here. The knight covers the hole, and we're ready to play f5. The knight is actually a fantastic beast on d6, attacking the e4 pawn and supporting the f5 break. Once we get f5, ef in, the bishop on g7 is going to be very happy as well. Alternatively, queen c2 to defend the pawn, but we can go after the bishop again. Next, we're ready to play f5 with our typical King's Indian counterplay. I could try h3, but again, we know how to deal with h3 by now. We just take. Normally white takes with the knight, the more logical move. Taking with the bishop, then I like to switch it slightly because we're not getting in knight c5 so easily. We'll play b6, bishop b7 as a way of attacking the pawn on e4. And then rook e8, just keep attacking the pawn. And now we can play knight c5. We can recapture with the b pawn, keep our structure intact. There's a lot of pressure on the e4 pawn. We have zero problems here. So take with the knight. We'll attack the pawn on e4 with rook e8. Queen defends it, and knight c5. Put more pressure on this pawn on e4. And white, once again, doesn't have a good way to defend it. Bishop f3 would be preferable. White doesn't want to play f3 and weaken his kingside horribly again. But this falls into a nice trap that is another one that's worth remembering in the King's Indian, because it pops up from time to time. We can sacrifice on e4, and then this queen h4 is a key idea. Obviously, we have pressure down the e-file, but the key point of the queen on h4 is that the bishop on e3 is attacked as well as the bishop on e4, thanks to the pin along the h4 to e1 diagonal. So moving the bishop from e4 loses to rook takes e3 check. The only way to keep both bishops is g4, but now we can take and play bishop f5. Nice pretty move. After g takes f5, we have rook takes e4 when the bishop drops on d4, because of course if he goes back to e3, we can take it anyway, utilizing the pin along the h4 to e1 diagonal. Therefore, f3 is necessary, but once again, knight h5, the usual stuff. That pawn doesn't belong on h3. I can try something with g4, but we'll jump in, take off the bishop. And b5 is certainly not forced, but a move I quite like. The point of it is we ask white what he's doing with this king. Clearly he can't castle kingside anymore, and the center doesn't look very safe. So let's open up the queen side. Once white takes with the pawn, we'll go a6 and open up the b and a files. Otherwise, if white takes with the knight, we can also attack down the b file. I'd say it's not necessary, but it's just creating further problems for white. The main move is closing the center with d5. And here we need to be careful. Playing on autopilot with knight c5 would be an error. This is because bishop e3 turns out to be a far more useful move than castle kingside. White can play knight d2 to defend the pawn on e4, and he's not blocked in his bishop on e3. That has two advantages for white over the normal position. First, after a5, white is going to be quicker to get in b4 because rook is defended on a1. Secondly, white can exploit the fact that he's not castled kingside yet and play g4, creating a bind on the kingside, stopping us getting in our f5 break. Here, it's quite likely that we'll just get strangled. We have no good breaks. Really avoid this kind of position at all costs in the King's Indian. Therefore, instead of knight c5, we should play a bit differently and exploit the fact that the bishops come out early with knight g4. We've hit the bishop, coming to g5. It could go back to d2 immediately, but then after f5, we'll just reach the same position. A tempo faster, we attack the bishop, and then normally go back to d2 here. Going to h4 is possible, but then I think we should drop back. The idea is to play g5, hitting the bishop, and then f5, and recapturing with the knight. For example, castle kingside, g5. We could also play a5 and knight c5. We don't need to rush things here. But g5 is thematic, and f5, and take. Now we have an interesting position, kind of thing that we'll see in the bayonet chapter a bit more. White has succeeded in winning the e4 square, but we have some counterplay thanks to our control of the d4 square. The bishop on g3 is also a bit strangely placed here. White has to be very careful about us going h5, h4, and just suddenly picking up that bishop. What white should do now is play knight d2. The knights coordinate better from c3 and d2 with further control of the e4 square. Jumping in immediately doesn't work as well. I can try and be active with knight g5, but knight f6 diffuses everything. The exchange is just accelerating our play. We're ready to play h5, h4, and this bishop is very low on squares on g3. The knight is ready to jump into d4 and play bishop f5 as well, so white's not even going to maintain the e4 square for long. And taking on g4 just loses material to knight takes g3, as both the bishop on g4 and knight on e4 are hanging. If white took immediately, it's possible, but our compensation is very good here. We're attacking the queen, and our idea is to play h6 next when that knight on g5 doesn't have a good square. If it goes back to f3 or h3, we can wreck white's structure. If it goes to e6, it's just losing a pawn back. Probably he should play knight e6 immediately, but we can be happy and take it either way. Followed by queen e7 and collect. The material will be there full, but we've absolutely no concerns. Therefore, it's probably better to try knight d2. And this knight is going to go to e4. It also stops our plan with g4 and h5, trapping that bishop on g3. b6 is a very subtle move. We have lots of options, but my idea is to meet knight e4 with knight c5. And we want to be able to recapture b takes c5 to maintain our structure. If we jumped in immediately with knight c5, then b4 might be a bit annoying. So we'll wait for the knight to land there first. So knight d4 and now knight c5. If white waited yet another move instead of playing knight e4, then we could play a5, stop b4 once and for all, and then play knight c5. It's all quite similar. Knight d2 is, this line is going to be very similar, but this is a bit more common than the immediate castle. We'll hit the bishop. Now, the bad news here is that we've transposed to quite a theoretical line of the Gligorich variation. That would be meeting e5 with bishop e3 in the main lines that we'll come on to later. I'm not recommending playing this way as black, but the reason I'm not recommending it is that white can try and get some unpleasant pressure with d takes e5 lines, and that's how white is playing these days. White has stopped closing the center with d5 via that move order. Via this one, of course, there wasn't an option, but there's no theoretical problems here. We can push with f5, and white has an option, has a choice to make. We're threatening f4, trapping the bishop, so of course he has to do something. He can play f3 to maintain his center. After knight f6, we're getting ready to play f4 and g4, opening up the king side. If white could drop back immediately, but g4. One very nice threat here is to play knight h5 and into f4 with a very active position. Well, there's not a lot that white can do about it. You can try h3 to control some more squares. But here is a good point to switch to c5. White's not able to create any kind of bind on the king side. We're still once attacking there, despite white's king being in the center. So we can take a timeout. With the pawn on c5, we make this knight on d2 look rather stupid. If white had time to play c5 and knight c4, then to take on d6 and knight b5, for instance, those knights would be very well placed, with a lot of pressure on our backward d-pawn. But if the pawn is stuck on c4, then both knight on d2 and bishop on e2 are just blocked out of the game. On bishop f2, f4. Timur Rajabov had this position 3 times against the opposition as black and scored 2 out of 3. And black is also scoring very well in correspondence. White just has a problem actually coming up with a plan here. And a big question mark that we'll see in a lot of h3 Kings Indians, and this has sort of become h3 Kings Indian style, when white delays casting the kingside, is where exactly he's going to put his king. Going kingside does not look tempting. Look how far ahead in the race we are. We've already got our pawns on f4 and g5. We'll shift the knight away from h6, play h5, g4, and we're very, very fast. So kingside is not at all tempting. So therefore, we should probably go queenside, but then we'll be quick to open up over there as well with a6 and b5 pawn sacrifice. In the meantime, it's not clear at all where white's own play is coming from. Therefore, taking on f5 is probably a safer move than f3. And here, I think we might as well just recapture. Knight f6 is theoretically considered better, but I have a different plan for that knight. I want it to land on c5 instead. Knight e4, b6. We want to recapture b takes c5 after knight c5. dc is a bit ugly. Now white can stop it for now with b4, a5, a3, but this has loosened the long diagonal quite a bit. White's going to have to be extremely careful about various tactics here. Another tactic after knight d4 is we're trying to take on b4, take on a1, and knight c2 check, forking king and queen. So white needs to do something quickly. Probably he castles. We can exchange some stuff. Now we can't go to c5, so we'll just go back to knight f6 with a good position with that bad bishop on g3. Grabbing this pawn on g5 fails to knight takes d5 when the knight is hanging on g5. We're very active and we've got a powerful outpost for the knight on d4. So white probably ignores our threat. We're happy to jump in. If white forces the exchange with b4, we're still happy. We'll exchange on e4, and it's very similar to what we just saw. a5 and knight d4, bishop f5. Our pieces come out nice and quickly. White can try bishop g4. As we've seen a few times, white is happy to exchange the light square bishops. But here we can just be patient. h6. We've got a few plans. We can improve our position with a5 to take control of b4. And rather than allowing the exchange of bishops, we can move our bishop around to g6, which is a nice active square for the bishop, putting more pressure on the e4 square, and also getting ready to play h5 at some point. Remember that this bishop on g3 is very short on squares. That is bishop back to h4, which is more Gligorich in character. Instead, bishop d2, and here we should plow on with f5. And this position is surprisingly sharp. White is going to try and take advantage of the fact that our knight is a little bit loose on g4, and we've played f5 early, so he's going to try jumping his knight into e6. On the other hand, we are going to say our knight is actually fantastically placed on g4 because we have loads of tricks down the f file. Knight takes f2 is actually already a threat. Now, white could take on f5 and then play knight g5 to have the f file closed. We could also try bishop g5, but we'll just go bishop f6. We're happy to exchange these bishops. After knight g5, obviously, we can't allow the knight into e6, So we'll play knight c5. And the most logical move here and most common is b4, kicking a knight away. But that is actually a big mistake. We'll see in a second. White should start with h3. Our knight is too strong on g4. But we can drop back. Here we can go to a6. We can't go to d7 because knight e6 is a problem. But we're ready to create some quick counterplay anyway with c6. We've got good central control now that white has exchanged his e-pawn for our one on g6. So b4 is logical. And white could easily think he's on top. We can't retreat back to d7 because of knight e6. And if knight a6, we're losing our control of the center and being forced to passive. But we have this very nice move, e4. It's a move that I'm really hoping to catch an opponent in. We threaten e3 when the knight on g5 will suddenly be hanging as the bishop's no longer defending it. If white takes with the bishop, then the other knight on c3 is hanging. So we're not actually sacrificing a piece here. White could try defending this knight, but it looks rather artificial. And now we have time to jump in with knight d3 check. You see another advantage to the pawn being pushed to e4. In exchange, now we're threatening rook e8 check, and white's king is caught in the center. So castle, h6. This pawn is just misplaced on h4. It's just a weakness in front of his king. Knight f3, knight f5, once again threatening to attack this pawn, as well as the one on c4. But I can try rook c1. The idea of knight takes c4, knight b5, or knight takes f3, queen takes, and at least he takes pawn on d3. But f4, opening up the other bishop, it's coming to g4, and we have a decisive attack already. Our pieces are just flowing into white's position. Taking on g4, with the idea if we recapture, then taking on c5, would be all well and good, but we have a position shack, knight d3 check, king has to move, and now instead of recapturing the even stronger knight takes f2, white might have exchanged off our knight from g4, but we still get to sacrifice on f2 with a knight. Take. We're a piece down temporarily here, but the two knights are still extremely vulnerable, and white also has problems with his king. King e1, e3. Now the knight on g5 is hanging, the bishop on d2 is hanging, and if he takes, the knight on c3 drops. So white is losing his extra material and a lot more. So white should take the knight. We'll play our e3, attacking this knight on g5. And actually, there's just no defense here either. We've got knight takes f2 as a threat as well if the knight retreats. There's going to be pressure down the long diagonal. It's just everything is dropping in white's position. So there we've seen one trick white can fall for. If white saw all that and goes, okay, let's just get rid of this knight immediately, so we don't have any of those problems, this falls to probably the most beautiful line in the chapter. We take on f2, take on e4. Now we exploit the pin with queen h4 check. Now if the knight retreats, which is actually necessary, but we play e4 and the knight on f3 is dropping, and the other pin is horrible too. So we're doing extremely well here. So king e3, defending the knight and hoping to run to the queen side. Check, king d3. Now, can you see the finish? That king is almost to the queen side. But we have queen takes e4 check. Okay, white doesn't have to take, but then he's a pawn down and got a king trapped in the center. And if he takes our queen, we've got checkmate mid-board. Hopefully you'll agree this is a very beautiful mate. So that's h3, which fails immediately. So knight g5 should be tried. Trying to jump in immediately to e6. So we control that square. But white, again, has quite a few potential pitfalls here to navigate. Castle slows the game down a bit. Now white's got ideas of b4, so let's just play a5. Want to keep the b4 square under control. To ef5, gf. White is succeeding in winning the e4 square, but he's not going to be able to maintain a knight on there for long because he's lost his light square bishop. And so we're not worried. Here we can stick the bishop on g6. Our pieces coordinate nicely. We've fully developed and no problems. And everything is fine here. Another trap would be e takes f5. You can see that it's quite tricky for White because what are the correct moves in other positions fall into different opening traps in subtly different ones. So just be on the lookout to catch your opponent out when he falls into one of these Heffalump traps. Here, instead of recapturing immediately, we can sack it again. Knight takes f2, and now rook takes f5. If the knight drops back to f3, we have e4, regaining the piece. Now the king moves, we can take on g5. Here we're the exchange for a pawn down, but we've got very good counterplay. Not only do we control the dark squares, but White's king is rather misplaced, and the rook is stupid on h1, locked in by his king. So White, at this point, should play b4 to kick our knight back, but we don't need to move it. F takes e4. Yet another sacrifice. One idea is opening up the d3 square for our knight, and the other, of course, is that we're threatening knight takes f2. So taking on c5, allowing knight takes f2 is just bad. We're winning the exchange. White could take on e4, but we'll swap. And again, we shouldn't touch our knight yet, but we can play bishop f5. We're going to take on e4 next move against anything, and then we'll be threatening to take on f2. So White needs to take our knight, but here we have no problems at all. Generally, this structure is perfectly healthy for us as long as White can't put a knight on e4 or install one there long term. And clearly here, with all the knights gone, it's not a problem. So castle is the best way to defend this pawn, but we can create further chaos with e3, exploiting the fact the knight is hanging on g5. We have a strange position here with 3 knights hanging, the one on g5, our 2 on g4 and c5, and the bishop on d2, both sides having 2 minor pieces under attack. So we take back 1 each. Now White could take on e3, but here we're perfectly fine. White has the e4 square, but he sacrificed a pawn for it. Taking on c5 isn't possible because of rook f4, and the c4 pawn falls. So therefore White has to just accept that he's a pawn down and try and hold with his control of the e4 square. It might be possible for him to hold the draw, but it's only black that can be better here. Therefore we should try taking on c8, and we'll take d2, the odd sequence where we're just taking each other's pieces continues. And finally we can stop and regroup in this position. It's quite a rich strategic position, and one that we have to think carefully about. Now, if the pawn on d2 looks doomed, but actually if we didn't have it, we might be in some trouble here. White has succeeded in his strategic aim of having a good knight on e4 against our bishop stuck on g7. And so it looks like we could be in some trouble. However, it's quite difficult for White to get rid of our pawn on d2 while maintaining the knight on e4. If White plays knight takes d2, we can suddenly turn the tables entirely with e4, activating the bishop on g7. It goes from a horribly blocked-in piece to a monster. Therefore, White needs to somehow take the pawn on d2 without allowing us to activate the bishop, which isn't so easy. So we'll see knight takes an e4, and this bishop is just too strong. Not only is it attacking the rook, it's also threatening to come to d4, attacking the pawn on f2. And the knight on d2 has gone from being an active piece on e4 to a piece blocked in by our pawn as well. So White should defend the knight. We can simply take on c5. Here, I think if White plays another waiting move, then we should just play bishop h6. That way, that once White, for example, if rook d1, bishop h6, then he can't take with the rook. And if he takes with the knight, then we can just take the knight. Make sure we don't have this good knight versus bad bishop scenario. Instead, in a correspondence game, White tried taking at this point, but of course, we should react with e4, we need to activate this bishop. Even if we're losing a pawn, we need to activate the bishop. Rook b1, rook e8. White took on b7, but here we're very active with e3, opening up more lines for our pieces. A very strong pawn sacrifice. This queen is extremely annoying on c2, pinning the knight on d2, as well as going after pawn on a2. We've got ideas too of rook takes e3 here, exploiting the pin down the g1, a7 diagonal. White can barely move and is in a lot of trouble. I hope that this video has shown you that you don't need to be worried by White's attempt to exploit our move order. In fact, White needs to be very careful to avoid a lot of opening traps. This wraps up my coverage of the Knight b7 variation. Hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks a lot for watching. See you.